In this lecture, we're going to be talking about the early dynasties. So we'll start with the Xia dynasty and talk about the Shang dynasty, where writing was developed. And briefly, we'll go over the Zhou dynasty, but it's really kind of a continuation of the things that we saw in the Shang dynasty. So the Xia dynasty was once thought to be legendary. And I'll kind of explain why that is a little bit later on, but white supremacy has a little bit to do with it. But we now consider it to be the Bronze Age of China. And although there's no writing from the time period, and some of the histories are kind of semi-legendary, there has been some archaeological work that has found the cities from these time periods. The Shang dynasty, however, we actually have historical documents, and I'll explain how Chinese writing was developed during this time period. So the histories that we have that come from later, people aren't sure if they were legendary like the previous ones. Like some are obviously legendary, ones from like 5,000 years ago, where they're talking about kings that are living and emperors that are living for hundreds of years. But it wasn't really known until some archaeological work was done, and we found some writing from the time period. And they actually used to think the name of the period was something else. From this writing, we found it's called the Shang Dynasty. And this is history. It's documented history as it was going along. So King Tang overthrew the Xia and began the Shang Dynasty in about 1700 BCE. Usually this writing, we're going to look at the dates will be on it, which is convenient for us. So during this time, the great cities disintegrated and then were built back up. And we had royal tombs. We're going to look at Lady Fu Hao's tomb. She died in about 1250 BC, and she was a consort of King Wu Ding, which means that she was basically a girlfriend. But she was also known to be, in the writing from the time period, a great general who was an advisor and someone who went out and fought battles for King Wu Ding. So saying that she's a consort is kind of just a part of what she did. You can see where the Shang dynasty is located. We're still much smaller than modern China. And really, when we're talking about China, we're talking about this area. The rest of it was considered to be foreign until recently. So during this time, we see a lot of the things that have been developing probably before this time, but we're seeing, we have some writing to kind of back it up. So ancestor worship and some human sacrifice. I'm going to give you a link to a video when we talk about Qin Shi Huangdi, and it'll talk about how human sacrifice functions in ancient Chinese society. And it may seem like, you know, the Chinese historians from modern times are talking about how like maybe some people consider it barbaric at the time, but a lot of cultures practiced human sacrifice, and most of you are listening to this almost certainly had ancestors that did the same. But I should say that human sacrifice, as a rule, only exists in farming cultures and, you know, pretty, you know, urban type of societies. That's usually when you see human sacrifice. Hunter-gatherers don't do such things. So this is the Records of the Grand Historian by Sima Qian. And it was written in the Han Dynasty. And when we talk about the Qin Dynasty and kind of how Qin Shi Huangdi was considered, we'll kind of see that Sima Qian is writing from about that dynasty, definitely from a point of view. But when it comes to the ancient stuff, he's just kind of repeating what people had been saying and writing for hundreds of years. And it was once thought to be inaccurate by the West. And the reason why is because Sima Qian's history goes back to about 7,000 BCE or so. And there's a lot of kind of like mystical, like I said, like long living, God-like kings and emperors. So it's kind of like the Old Testament of the Bible where you have people living hundreds of years. So obviously that part doesn't represent real history, but the later parts going back to the Shang Dynasty, which Sima Qian had a different name for it at the time, those parts turned out to be fairly accurate, which is amazing when you think of the time period between when this stuff was written down originally, and I'll show you how it was written down, to Sima Qian, which is 1,500 years later in some cases. it was fairly accurate. So part of the reason why the West may have thought that it was inaccurate, because for the longest time in the West, it was kind of informed by white supremacy, especially after, well, it didn't really exist before about 1500 or so. So with the advent of Western imperialism, um, both in the New World where we're sitting, in the Americas, and also in Asia and in Africa, there was a need to show the rest of the world as less sophisticated. And they didn't want to believe that there was very ancient cultures in some of these places, because then it would take away this kind of justification for imperialism that they were civilizing the rest of the world. So if the rest of the world was already civilized for thousands of years, justification doesn't work. So modern scholarship looks at this and says, that's really amazing. This history is very old, and it's relatively good. So the first writing that was developed in China was developed for divination. So I think it's kind of useful to think of societies that develop writing. And there's three that may have developed it independently, um, possibly four. So we have the first one would be the Sumerians. That's in Mesopotamia, which is in the modern day Iraq. And they developed the earliest writing system. And what they developed it for was kind of boring. It was to keep the books. So for trading items, and also those societies were what you call temple societies. So the leadership would kind of provide food and materials to everyone. So a lot of the early writing was that sort of thing, kind of saying what had been handed out to people. They didn't really use money, so when people did work, they were just, or they didn't do work, they were just provided with what they needed. And then one possibility is that the ancient Egyptians developed writing independently, but it's possible also they were influenced by the Sumerians. But either way, they developed hieroglyphics as a type of spiritual power writing. So more similar to what we're seeing here with China. And then the other culture that we're absolutely certain had developed writing independently were the Mayans. So that's in modern day Mesoamerica, Mexico. And they developed it to keep calendars. So a lot of agricultural societies, they think calendars are super important, and the Mayans thought it was even more important than everybody else. So in China, they developed it for divination. They would write something on a bone. This one's an oracle bone, so an ox scapula. And it would be like a question. So it would be something like they would have the name of the person who's asking the question and the date, which is good for us. And then they would ask a question like, if I go to fight this battle, am I going to win? If I go on this diplomatic mission, will I return home safe? Something along those lines. And then the diviner would take it and heat it up, and it would create cracks, and the diviner would read the cracks and be able to give you the answer. So you might imagine, if you're doing this job for elite people, especially for kings and other people who want to be fighting battles, you would want to make sure that your answers aren't too clear. Because if you get the wrong answer, it might not turn out so well for you. So this earliest Chinese writing was developed for that reason, for divination. And nice of them to put names and dates because it makes it easy for us. So what had happened over time, again, China was an empire. So it was basically, since ancient times, people who were really different ethnicities, had different languages, traditions, were taken over by what would later become China. So there's all these spoken dialects, but eventually written Chinese was developed to cover them all. So if you can read Chinese, you can understand Mandarin Chinese, or you can understand Cantonese, which wouldn't be intelligible to people in a spoken word, but in the written word, it's the same sort of thing. So this is very convenient for Chinese scholarship, and it's probably, especially if you want to create an empire too, it's pretty convenient for that. So these early characters, they do have some resemblance with what modern characters. Modern characters are called Han characters. We'll kind of talk about why that is a little bit later on. And some of them are similar to it, but someone that reads modern Chinese probably won't be able to read most of these. These are very archaic, and some other characters develop later on. But it is pictographic writing, and it becomes a little bit more complicated. It can be syllabic sometimes as well. So what's interesting is a lot of cultures started out with pictographic writing or symbols, and then dropped it in favor of alphabetic, and that didn't happen in China. So as a result, learning how to write in China is fairly difficult compared to most cultures. So it's done a little bit later in China sometimes than it is in cultures that use alphabetic writing. So some of them have other things, like this one has brands. Also, this particular scapula has the earliest mention of the supreme god Shangdi, who lived in Tian, which is kind of like a heaven-like thing, but it's also can be considered continuous with the earth. And when they say supreme god, they're thinking more like Zeus, not like the way that people in Abrahamic religions think of God as the creator and all-knowing and all-loving. Instead, it's more Shangdi is kind of the top of the gods. And some of the emperors at this time started to associate themselves with Shangdi. And we'll see later on that emperors will consider themselves to be gods themselves. So the inscriptions, they refer to various sacrifices of the ancestors and date to the period of King Wu Ding, because this date is written on here, about 1200 BC. So by the way, the dates are done with the reign date of the king. So, you know, it's a little bit hard to say exactly the year, but we know the relative years exactly. When you get in close, again, you can see them. This is archaic. Some of them sort of do resemble modern Han characters, but most of them would be unreadable. So this is a tomb of Lady Fu Hao, and what's really cool about this is that unlike most tombs in China, which had been dug up and the pieces that were in it distributed sometimes thousands of years ago, this one was found pretty much intact, and she died about 1250 BC. It was found in 1976 in Yanshu, which is modern Anyang. And she was a consort of King Wu Ding, but she was also an advisor and a general. So we have oracle bones that are talking about her and the advice that she was giving to the king, and also on battles that she was planning with others. So, they wanted to put everything on these bones and ask to see if it was the right thing to do. So you can see it being dug up pretty deeply. One thing that happens is in China, it's kind of like ancient Egypt. When you have a culture that's this long, there's basically cultures stacked on top of each other, and you can dig a hole practically anywhere and find something sometimes. So this was a little bit of luck, and it being intact, it's very interesting. This is a reproduction, but what it shows is all of the pieces exactly how they were when it was originally uncovered. So what is pictured here, and everything is in the exact same place as it originally was, are hundreds of pieces of jade and bronze items, some of which were already 1,000 years old. So they were collecting ancient Chinese items. Ivory, bone, lacquered wood. So ivory, lacquered wood, and bronze, that's elite people stuff. You're only going to find that in elite burials. Lacquered wood, I'm going to post a video later on. You'll see that that's a very expensive process. And thousands of cowrie shells. Cowrie shells have been used by some people as jewelry or perhaps like kind of trade items, not exactly like money, but not exactly not like money. So we're not sure exactly what the meaning was for people at this time. They didn't really talk about it. And then this is unfortunate, but 6 dogs, 46 human skeletons, and there's 16 that you can see pictured around there. And they were sacrificed. So they had their heads cut off. And in the video I'm going to post, you'll be able to see that they were probably poisoned first. And the axes that were used to cut off their heads were thrown into the tomb. So kind of like the mob, They dig your grave and then throw the gun in after they shoot you. So all of these items were found, and the video will kind of explain the complications where why would somebody volunteer to work for an elite person if they knew they were going to be sacrificed? They'll kind of talk about how that is pretty complicated. If you think you wouldn't do it, that's probably what ancient people thought as well. So this one was found in Fu Hao's tomb, and it might be earlier, but it is Shang Dynasty style. So many of the bronzes were very old at the time of the burial, and some Liangju jade, so the culture we looked at that was 1,000 years earlier than this sometimes, were found in there. And what you'll notice with this one is it says owl-shaped zun. Zun is just the term for this type of vessel. And you may notice there's other animals that are in here. You might even want to pause the video. Usually when I do this in person, we pause the video and try to find the various animals. So it gets kind of complex, and sometimes the animals are chimera, meaning multiple animals put together. But if you look very closely, you can see it's an owl, a rather cutely proportioned owl as well. And there's a lot of incrustations on this. All of this discoloring around here. The original items would not have looked like this. They would have been polished, and they would have had a very brassy look to them. So like brass instruments that you see in an orchestra. But over time, they grow this crust, and that's actually protective. So it stops it from tarnishing, or from wearing away. And if you were to clean it off, it might be a problem. But that's not the way they originally looked. Again, in the video I'm going to show you, they're going to have some reproductions where they'll show what these pieces would have originally looked like. It's kind of amazing. I wish one could be they could make some copies so we could see what they would have looked like originally. I think they're really cool. And also collectors want to see this stuff because you can test little bits of it and be sure that it's real. Because making a bronze like this would be relatively simple to fake it. And they go for a lot in the market. So the collectors that want to buy these types of things get all gushy when they see all of this gross incrustation, because they know it can be tested and they can know if it's real. So how they make these, they're really small. And if you get a chance to go to the DIA after this semester, or another museum that has these bronzes, you can see that they're extremely detailed. It's almost like microscopic in detail. So how they're able to create that is through a process called piece mold casting. Bronze casting was developed about 6,000 BCE, independent from the West. A lot of cultures developed bronze casting independently. And the way they do this is a little bit different than bronze casting is usually done, where you have one mold and then you have to toss it. This one, they would have a core model, and that would be the same thing you would make for, it's basically just the shape of the vessel that you want to make. And then you have these pressed sections, which are made out of clay, which is pretty normal. But what's a little bit different is this clay is fired first. And so what that does is it makes it a little bit more long lasting. So you could use this same mold a few times before it starts to wear away. Whereas normal molds use it once, and sometimes you have to break it off. But either way, it wouldn't work very well a second or third time. So they're reassembled around the mold, and you can use it over and over again. And it creates this extreme detail. So a lot of these, we can see developments of what we saw in Neolithic China. So this one is the ogre mask. Again, looking more with the types of organic curves that they have, probably looking more of what you might think of when you think of ancient or traditional Chinese art. And this is a ritual wine storage jar. So a lot of these things that I'm showing you are the fancy ones. They may have been used during special events or rituals, including human sacrifice, as the video will explain. But they wouldn't be used every day. But they are in the shape of things that people would use every day. So this ogre mask may have had different meanings. This culture seemed to be kind of shamanic, meaning it was run by priests who did things like divination and kind of an animistic religion along with it. So possibly the shamans transformed into ogres. And this is pretty common in most cultures around the world. Again, you probably have ancestors that did this sort of thing. So with the ogres, we also have that kind of abstract type of creatures that we had seen in previous styles, and then a lot of these designs. But again, the way that the curves are developing, you're going to see how they're going to develop in the styles that the first thing you look at it, you probably think of China. So you get in close, and there's quite a bit of symmetry and detail. Again, these items aren't very big. But what I thought was kind of cool is when you see these details, and when I first saw it in a class like this, I thought, wow, that looks a lot like Northwest Native American art. And I'm sure you've seen it before. I'm going to show you a picture in a moment. And I saw Maori art later on, especially when the tattoos were unfortunately being appropriated by people in the 90s. And I also saw similar patterns. So I didn't necessarily think there was a connection. I thought maybe just people came up with the same sorts of patterns. But what was interesting is O'Reilly, who wrote the textbook that's used for this class, also mentioned that these designs are kind of similar. With the Maori ones, possibly there is an influence because the ancestors of the Maori may have had contact with China. They came from Southeast Asia, so it's entirely possible. And then, even more interestingly, recent research on Northwest Native Americans showed that a lot of them aren't genetically related to every other Native American in North and South America. So there could be a possibility that they were also exposed to these. But again, probably independent. We're talking about places that are rather far away, but it is interesting to see similar patterns. So you've probably seen totem poles before. Those come from Northwest Native American people and thunderbirds. So this particular design with these very graphic white, red, and black designs, they've kind of also, like Maori tattoos, been appropriated quite often. But you kind of see similar sorts of formal innovations going on with this one. And then this is a Maori one, which has even greater resemblance. Some of these Maori masks represent some of the tattoos that people would have, especially elite people amongst the Maori. So again, not saying that there is a connection, but it would be interesting if there was a connection. So this one is a cool one if you want to pause and try to find all the various animals in there, because there's a bunch. And I'm going to show you another side, and you can see them as well. So spouted ritual wine vessel, and it's really small. As you can see, it's only 13 inches wide. Again, the patina, it's not intended. It was originally highly polished and even painted, so we would have bright colors on some of these, especially the ones with animals. And you can kind of look in and see the various animals. I'll just give you one that's the easiest to see. This is a chicken. You can see the beak right here. And chickens were bred in China going back thousands of years. It's still a big thing. They have these incredible roosters with very long tails like peacocks. But there's a bunch of animals you can see in here as well. And so if you can't find something to put on an extra credit board, go through here, try to find some animals and throw them up there and see what other people think. So when you see it from this side, you can also probably see some other animals throughout. These designs where we have these kind of spirals, they may represent lightning or thunder or both, or just a kind of energy that's in the sky. We don't know. That's what later Chinese people looked at, and they named the theme for those types of ideas. So some of them are a little bit more naturalistic, still relatively abstract. But this one, I think you recognize right away that it's an owl, quite a cute owl, but it's a vessel as well. You can take this top off. I think I want one of these. It's similar to ivory antecedents, so there's a lot of little animals like little zoos that wealthy people had carved out of ivory that you find in their tombs. So they thought they were kind of treasured items. When I first saw this, it made me think of Clash of the Titans, which was the Perseus story from ancient Greece, but it was done in the 80s. I think there's a more recent Clash of the Titans I haven't seen. This is it right here. Lots of famous actors maybe wasted their talent on this. That's Laurence Olivier right there. Burgess Meredith. I forget this dude's name, but he's real pretty. He plays Perseus. And the special effects were really bad. They were really bad at the time. I remember when I watched it as a kid, I was like, that's bad. But there was this cute little Bobo character, which is from the Greek myth, that was an automaton. So like kind of a metallic creature that moved. And they basically make him into almost like a robot mascot for Perseus. And here's a toy version of it if you want to buy it. So that was the first thing I thought when I saw these, but it does show you that it's relatively naturalistic compared to the abstract styles that we were seeing earlier. So this one is a bit of a mystery because there isn't anything else like it, and it seems to have more relationship with maybe Mongolian nomads. Mongolia, they didn't call themselves Mongolians at the time, are in the steppes, rather wilderness area, just north of central China. So this is probably new to the Shang, and they may have, maybe been inspired Mongolians or just thought their imagery was really cool. They have a lot of tattoos with some of this imagery, the Mongolians. So who knows? But again, this is one of those ones where usually I take it to the class. As you can see, the description says a bear or a tiger swallowing a man. So if you want, you could take the extra credit board and try to figure out what animals you see, what animal is this, what the hell is going on, because we don't actually know. And I asked the class, and you may find it interesting. So here's another angle. If you want to pause it and take a look at it, you can see a little bit more detail here. As far as what's going on, we don't know because they didn't keep making it later on. When you get in really close, you can see there's probably some missing pieces. Some of these rings may have had other rings that are attached to it. If you get a chance to go to the DIA, you'll be able to see what I mean. That was a thing that kind of developed over time. So Zhou Dynasty continues what we see in the Shang Dynasty, and I'm mostly showing you bronzes. And what happens is we see a little bit more complexity. So you may find these like nicer or more interesting, or you may find them like a little bit too much. It depends. But Zhou's the pronunciation, and I know neither of those spellings seem to make any sense. But translating the sounds of Chinese into English alphabet is pretty difficult. So Wu Wang conquered the Shang Dynasty in about 1045 or 1050 BC, and they moved the capital to Xi'an on the Wei River. And as you can see, we're expanding, we're getting pretty big. So during Zhou rule, Chinese culture was transformed from a mixed agricultural hunting society with an animistic form of religion dominated by shamans to a highly organized and feudalistic society with a hierarchy of priestly and secular authorities. I think since O'Reilly has written this, that there has been more archaeology showing some pretty complex cities later on, but the basic idea is correct. We do see a more stratified society, and we do have more evidence of the cities themselves. So that's what happens after many years of settlements. So this piece is this sort of piece, which is really difficult to make, is still made today. And sometimes they're almost made as puzzles. Like you look at them and you're like, how did they get that stone inside of that other stone? Because remember, jade is a very hard stone. It's brittle. It's difficult to work with. But once it's made, it can sometimes have this very translucent quality. So this piece has 4 movable parts. Not easy to get this together. There's 3 rings. The middle ring is movable, but top and bottom rings are fixed. So you can see how we have these dragon and phoenix figures. So dragons and phoenixes. Dragons will be associated with the emperor, and phoenixes with the royal family and spirituality in general. So we'll see those appear later on in China and also in Japan. So as far as jade goes, by this time period, so we're talking about 200, 100 BC, so a little bit later than this, in the Yi Jing, and ideas around jade and the qualities of jade came to have meanings attached to them. So in the I Ching, they were known as the divine material. And then Confucius, Master Kong, in the Li Ji, which is the Book of Rites, talks about these qualities and how they relate to this cultured person. So the first thing is gleaming surface that represents benevolence. So especially if you're a wealthy person, and that's who he's really talking to, it means being able to be good to people and making sure that you're taking care of people that are less fortunate to you. Luminosity, which represents knowledge. So elites were expected to be educated. Hardness means uprightness. So sticking to things that you know are right. Compact and strong represents intelligence. So again, cultivating these ideas is important for elites. Does not conceal flaws. So truthfulness, although that's more of an ideal, as we'll see later on. You know, elites tend to backstab each other. So cannot be blemished. Moral leadership. So these things were expected to be followed by elites, but as you might expect, elites didn't always follow these types of ideas. So when you get in close, you can see, again, there's this kind of like repetitive nature. And we have the dragons looking very much like they will for the next couple thousands of years, and phoenixes as well. So phoenix is just a kind of mythical bird. All cultures have some version of it. So what I thought was interesting with these pieces is they kind of resembled the types of things that you would see in the